Okay, today's lesson is names for God, or words used in reference to God in the Bible. I would suggest you get a blank page in your notebook or a fresh sheet of paper so you can take a picture of this and submit it for notes. Depending on where you are, you should have finished Genesis 1, and the book of Genesis in the first few chapters uses two main words for God. One of them is Elohim, and Elohim is actually a plural. There are usually a few students who notice the fact that God says, "Let us make humans in our image, male and female," and that strikes them as very odd. And it could be a remnant of polytheism, or it could be a superlative. Apparently Hebrew sometimes uses the plural to say the best or the most or the greatest. Or it could be a royal we. Let us make man in our image. So Elohim is usually translated as God in our Bible, just simply G-O-D, no capitals, compared to another word I'll cover in just a few minutes. And the singular version of Elohim is the word El. And El was the name of one of the local Canaanite gods, the head of the Canaanite gods. And so it could be that as the ancient Hebrews moved from polytheism or monolatry to monotheism, that they gave the plural of El as the name of their god. Linguistically, it's interesting. I flew on El Al Airlines to Israel a couple of years ago, and the word for El Al means to the heavens, El Al, and the word Elohim, you can see that right here, A-L, so to the heavens, or maybe even literally to God. Another word that's linguistically related to El and Elohim is the word Allah, which is the Arabic name for God. You might be familiar with a friend who's Muslim, or you may have heard in the news the call Allah Akbar, which means God be praised, or Allah be praised, or to the greater glory of Allah. Interesting that Arabic-speaking Jews and Arabic-speaking Christians also use the word Allah for prayer, or for God in prayer. If you go to St. Charbel's Church here in Portland, it's a Maronite Rite Catholic church. They use Aramaic, the language of Jesus, as well as Arabic, that during the Catholic Mass you will hear the word Allah pronounced. So Allah and El are all related to each other. The other name for God that appears, especially in the first few chapters of the Bible, and I'll point this out to you, is the word Yahweh, which is God's name. And here I've written a specific way for a reason, and I'll explain that. When I took Old Testament in college, my rabbi, who was Jewish, obviously, used the word Yahweh frequently, but Orthodox Jews, and especially Hasidic or Haredi Jews, do not utter this word. It's God's personal name, and their respect for that means that you wouldn't address God on a first-name basis, just as a student it would be awkward for them to call a faculty member by their first name. Matter of fact, the Catholic Church, and this is worth putting into your notes because there's a test question on this, the Catholic Church some years ago asked congregations to stop singing songs that had the word Yahweh in it because such songs give offense to our Jewish brothers and sisters, or many of our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so there used to be songs like, "To you, Yahweh, I lift up my soul, oh my God," excuse me, or "Yahweh, I know you are near." And they have gotten rid of those songs or changed the lyrics to those songs. Instead, in the Jewish tradition, instead of actually uttering God's name, one replaces it with Adonai. And Yahweh then is God's personal name, which is revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the name that's not supposed to be uttered. And instead, one substitutes the word Adonai or Adonai, which means Lord. In our Bible, this word Yahweh is always translated or always written out in capitals, capital L-O-R-D, or small capital O-R-D. Whereas if you see the word Lord with lowercase letters, capital L, lowercase O-R-D, that is a translation of Adonai. But when praying in Hebrew, one would say Adonai, so Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, instead of actually uttering God's name. And I'm going to add something interesting about that. This is the Hebrew word, the tetragrammaton for God's name, Yod-He, Vav-He. And I took a group of students to the Pacific Science Center in Seattle some years ago, and they had the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was very interesting that the name for God was actually written in a very old script, and it was also a little bit larger, like it was bold-faced on a computer program, that God's name was written in a different font and made a little bit bigger and a little bit darker, either to emphasize the importance of God or maybe to make it so that somebody didn't accidentally utter God's name, that they saw it coming before they got to it. So, speaking of my trip to Israel, I was at a mall once and we were having lunch, and I was very pleased that I figured out the word falafel from the menu. But Hebrew doesn't actually have vowels. It has some consonants that are put in to indicate certain vowels, but Hebrew is essentially consonants when you look at street signs in Israel. And I was very, very pleased that at the local Pizza Hut, I could figure out the word for pizza. Pe, Yod, Tzad He, and then a He, which could be translated as pizza because the letter for P and F is the same. But as I was reading through a sign, not this sign, but another sign, there was one word that was puzzling me, and I was trying to work through it. And the word was Mem Zayin Resh Lamed. And I was trying to figure out what kind of pizza this was. It was Mzurl. And then I figured it out. It was mozzarella. So in looking at words, sometimes one has to figure out what the vowels should be. And it's possible I could have gotten it completely wrong. If I had taken the word invitation, for instance, and instead of putting in an O and an A and an E and an A, if I had taken the vowels for invitation, I would have ended up with a very interesting word, miseralo. So sometimes putting in vowels would be helpful so that people know what the word actually is. And this was actually done a long, long time ago by some Hebrew scholars who said, let's take little dots and dashes and things, and let's indicate what vowel sounds should be said. So this is the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is silent. This is Dalet, a soft D. This is Nun, and this is Yod. And so by putting little dots and dashes and marks underneath, we can tell people that how to pronounce it. So this is Adonai or Adonoi. This is the word that's used instead of God's name in the Bible. And so we put these little marks underneath there, which then leads to an interesting problem. We don't want some kid at their bar mitzvah accidentally saying God's name. And when we're putting these marks into the Bible to indicate how to pronounce things, what should we do for God's name? I've been told that literally the name for God is kind of impronounceable. It's almost like breathing in and breathing out. Yahweh. This word, which means I am, you should get that down too. Moses is talking to God and says, who are you? And God says, I am. That's the literal translation of Yahweh. I've been told that it's unpronounceable, but if we're going to put vowel marks in, we don't want people to actually say God's name in temple at the Bimmy. So how are we going to handle this? Well, somebody came up with the idea of taking the vowels for Adonai or Adonoi and putting them into the consonants for God's name, so that if somebody's reading through the Bible and they see God's name, they see the vowel marks for Adonai, and they say that instead, which then leads to a really interesting word. If one literally reads through the Bible, they see the consonants for God's personal name mixed together with the vowels for the word that's replacing God's name, Adonai, which comes out as this funny Yahovah word, or when it's transliterated into Latin, it becomes Jehovah. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are using a name for God that isn't really God's name. It's kind of the consonants for mozzarella with the vowels for invitation. So if you ever have a Jehovah's Witness knock on your door, please be polite to them, but you might give them a little bit of a Hebrew lesson and explain how the word Jehovah actually came about. It's not really a word, it's a combination of two words, the consonants from one and the vowels for another. Speaking of Hebrew letters, I am offering extra credit, or I offer extra credit every year for students who want to learn the Hebrew alphabet. You do not need to learn how to write it, although this is an interesting guide. It gives you the first, the second, and the first, the second, and the third stroke, and has all the letters except for their final forms. But here are the Hebrew letters: Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet is a hard H, Tate, Yod, and Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, which is a soft S, Ayin, which is a glottal stop, Pei and Sadhe, which is a hard S, Kof and Resh, Shin and Sin, and Tav. And again, some words there's a soft version, Beit or Veit versus Beit, or Pei versus Fei. But I learned a version to the tune of Yankee Doodle, or Barney the Dinosaur, if that's what you prefer. And there are other versions you can find online. 10 points of extra credit, partial credit if you get most of it, or at least half of it. I'll give you a 6 out of 10, or 6 out of 0. But the version I learned is Aleph, Beit, and Gimel, Dalet, He and Vav and Zayin, Chet and Tate and Yod and Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pei and Sad, He, Kof and Resh, Sin and Shin and Tav. One student did one a few years ago that had both versions. It was Aleph, Beit, Veit. There's a hard D sound, there's a soft D sound, kind of like stopped versus patted. But if you want to learn that song, I can post it online, and anytime before final exams, you can do that. So that ends our lesson, and this page is only extra credit. And maybe you get a chance to go to Israel someday, because it's pretty amazing.